Playing devil's advocate a little bit with that title that you can see there, Our Critical Friend. Some of you, I'm sure, will be quite happy with the idea of having a critical friend, that support mechanism, that mentoring, again, an important aspect in terms of the ART mission. But where would feedback essentially support that ringing development? Should it be the friend that helps us in terms of our ringing developments? And very definite, I would say, yes, it has a key part to play. When used positively or effectively, then it really embeds some of those principles and helps in that learning journey as we potentially move forward. But we can also think that sometimes feedback can work against us. It can be a bit of an enemy. We've probably all got experiences of when sometimes feedback has been ineffectual, that we may have been on the receiving end of that. Sometimes we may reflect back and think about some of the feedback that we've given that hasn't necessarily been that successful. And sadly, some ringers have disappeared who would have been very, very successful in terms of part of the ringing bands and ringing community, because they have been put off and put down by some of the feedback that has been given to them. So we always need to be thinking, reviewing and reflecting on how we're potentially delivering feedback. And it can be, you know, have it being an open approach in being able to do that. The final word then is critical. And again, perhaps, you know, that can have a different viewpoint depending where you're coming from. You know, if we went into a bit of a breakout room and said, what do you think we mean by critical? You know, it may be the actual information that we're giving in terms of the feedback. Sometimes, you know, we don't have to sort of always sort of gloss over some of those difficulties. We may have to give some of that hard detail and try and do that effectively and positively. We have to be critical to move forward. And sometimes we need to think about how we can potentially deliver that. You could say that feedback is critical in terms of ringing development and how we push art forward in that sense. And again, having that critical value. For me, on the education side, there's also the view that potentially we develop our learners, our students, to think critically. You know, that's part of the ethos that I'm involved with in my sort of teaching, getting students to think critically, to write critically, don't necessarily accept the status quo, potentially to think about different ways to skin that cat. And, you know, one person's view, compare that to somebody else's, or a different technique in developing that forward. So reflect, review, and develop a critical nature in all that we do in terms of our feedback. So as we move forward then, potentially, let's just think about where we've come across feedback in our art journey so far as art teachers. We have gone through that assessment, we've gone through the accreditation. Here's the two statements that are relevant to both M1 and M2F, M2C. The teacher demonstrates the ability to give feedback in a positive manner. That's all it potentially says in that criteria in the logbook that we're well used to. And we have to potentially think about how we're doing that, taking our lesson plans, acting those out, and then reviewing those and taking that potentially forward. The feedback that we are verbally giving and reflecting on to our potential learners, the support that the mentor gives to us as we are developing our teaching development, the feedback that is being given to us there. So how is the teacher able to potentially do that? At the M2F and M2C level, we think then about obviously the individual ringer, but the band as well, when we think about bringing in the elements then of change ringing. A couple of other words there that potentially would be important: constructively, positive and constructive, just to have a think about that. The assessors, in terms of the guidance that's given to them, to have some form of moderation in terms of the assessment that's being delivered, and use guidance given to this, and this is freely available for teachers to have as well. So this fleshes out that particular statement dealing with feedback. It should be accurate, it should help to provide motivation, it should be rewarding effort but not necessarily rewarding poor performance. The importance of giving feedback appropriately, quickly, giving it an action that takes it forward. So all of these things are embedded within the art mission and the way in which we are able to take that potentially forward then. So just thinking about some of those potential words. Feedback, it's basically reviewing something that has just happened. And if we're not careful, that's all that we do. We just report back on what has happened. We need to think about how we can develop that, flesh that out, and then make better use of that information that's already occurred or that action that's already taken place. Positive. So does positive always mean good news? Does it mean that we potentially can do it successfully or effectively? On reflection, that positively may be better written as effectively. That may be a discussion point we want to think a little bit about later, but constructively, breaking it down and taking that forward. Now, think about the learners that we have. How do they take that advice? Do they like that word as they're doing something? Does it need to be reported about afterwards? Are they somebody that laps that up and then we can encourage them to give their viewpoints back to us as well? Is it something that we need to break down bit by bit so that we're not overloading some of that information that we're doing? So constructively should be appropriately as well, that we're thinking about there. So break down some of those words that we're effectively thinking about. Now, embedded in some of the areas in which the art tutors will be talking about in terms of the theory that we'll be doing on those day courses, and encouraging our teachers to go back and develop and to really take on that potential learning technique, is the idea of the classic feedback sandwich. So potentially the interesting bit of the sandwich is the stuff in the middle that potentially we use of value, but the bread will support that. So the idea that we take that positive viewpoint from the word go, is there something that we recognize that effectively is good? Where are the good things? How can we attune the ringer for any forthcoming comments and advice? The good information that we can potentially see. We do have to take care with that, because if we overload the good information, that's what they will concentrate on, and anything we then take forward, they'll just be bathing in the glory of the positive comments. And potentially we need to then take that forward to think about that juicy bit potentially in the middle. How can we make some things better? So what is that feedback taking it on to do? What are we going to be working on? And that's the element, not just of reporting what's happened, it's how can we potentially make that better. In education, we start to talk about moving feedback to feed forward, and that's the element that's already built into our art activities at Ethos. The conclusion, the wraparound that supports the sandwich then, is how do we provide that advice on taking that forward? Where are the opportunities that we can make things better? So that's the how bit. So we thought about the good bits, the things that we will hopefully make better, but how are we going to achieve that? What's the journey that we are potentially moving in? So the feedback that we could be given, the verbal feedback, it may be positive. We sometimes have to give that negative view, but how can we still do that effectively? Or feedback can be neutral, so it's information with no positive or negative connotations, but we're building the self-confidence of our ringers and encouraging them to report back on how they receive that. So that they have an active part in taking that feedback and moving it forward as well. We encourage the journey through that feed forward, but get our ringers and our learners to be actively involved in that journey as well, and to be reflecting and reporting back. I think that's an important view as well, so that our ringers potentially see the advice that we give and are able to use that effectively. And not just to absorb it, but to really sort of talk around it and be involved and have a critical viewpoint essentially with it. So the idea, this is just a statement a decade or so ago. This is David Carless, an educator from the University of Hong Kong, who said this statement here in 2006: we learn faster and more effectively when we have a clear sense of how we are doing and what we might need then in order to improve. And that is part of bringing in goals. And those goals should be part of taking that feedback and putting it feed forward. So here's the education speak. So we talk a fair bit now in education about feeding forward and feeding up. So the classic reporting is the feedback. How am I going? How am I doing? You may see that better as how am I doing? The reflection, the review and the reflection. But where are we then taking that forward? Ultimately, we're taking it higher. So we're building the goals, we're aiming for those goals that we're wanting to achieve. So that feedback, that review, taking that effective and moving it forward as well. Where to next? And ultimately, the journey that we're going. Now that needs to be adaptable. We need to be always thinking on our feet about the journeys that we're making for our ringers, the goals. So we can think about performance, achievement, short-term, long-term goals, and potentially developing. So it's good to see that what we embed in art is already being used, you know, within the sort of education, the coaching theory potentially as well. So the idea of feeding forward your feedback, it may be a bit of a cliched statement, but it's one that, you know, I'm forever being asked to do in terms of the feedback that I give my students when I report back on their work. So how are we giving that advice? And of course, sometimes that may be, you know, the difference there is you're giving advice back on an assignment or an exam or something, whereas in ringing, we're doing that on a weekly basis, many times on a practice session. So we're always trying to keep this organic and moving potentially forward. Joe Hirsch, an educator, again, American, but has written this book called The Feedback Fix. And he came up with the idea that feed forward, you know, we can potentially think that of repair. So what are we essentially thinking about there? This is a way of shifting from feedback to feed forward. The traditional feedback just describes the past that's happened. The future we can develop. You know, we can take what's happened and effectively move that forward. We can't necessarily repair the past, but we can fix it to move it moving forward. So the idea that feeding forward regenerates talent, it's encouraging the recipients to think wider and bigger and the goals they're likely to achieve. It's expanding the possibilities, getting them to think positively about the journey that they're potentially making and encouraging them on the way. It's particular for that particular individual. So focused, appropriate, and that's not necessarily easy. Authentic, what's the problem we're trying to fix? Not overglossing it with too much stuff, but just pulling it down to something that we know that we can potentially work on and look for a better way forward. And with that, it will potentially have that impact. It has a plan for taking things forward. And we can refine that as we're going on, the teamwork that we have within ringing. We may find that somebody can explain something a lot better, use one of our other ringers to explain something that we're trying to do. It may be that one of our learners has gone through this experience much more recently than we have and is able to give some of that feedback as well. So thinking about that sort of that peer feedback could be of use as well. I think that's an interesting statement that Joe Hirsch comes up at the bottom. You know, window gazers tell others what to see. If we can hold up a mirror to challenge the recipients of the feedback, for them to see it themselves and to take that and have an active part to play. So in summing up then, you know, this is just a statement from a nice image I've found that potentially, and we may want to add on to this jigsaw, what should good feedback be like? Having a future, goal referenced, tangible. Is it able to be taken, that information and advice? Is it able to be appraised to work forward? So what are the actions built into that? Are they appropriate? Are they timely? So that we can work on them and not put them on one side and we come back 10 minutes for the week, you know, in a week's time. And the consistency that we want to develop. Is it proactive, that we can control that situation and have our own goals for taking that forward? So it'll be interesting to see whether you have some elements to think about what we're doing. So teacher feedback, obvious, that's what we're talking about, but encouraging our ringers to reflect themselves and to feedback to us on our performance and giving that advice and on being critical themselves. Of course, some of that self-feedback is how they're perceiving through the muscle memory, their eyes, their ears, their muscles, but also what can they report back. I know some of you have heard me say this before, but my classic thing early in my sort of tutoring career on the Kiel residential course many years ago, when I stood behind somebody, and of course standing behind, giving that feedback, really critical. And I remember standing behind somebody for Grand Straw Plain Bob doubles, and I said afterwards, how was that? And this lady said, well, it would have been good if you hadn't yapped at me the whole way through it. You know, so the feedback that I was given wasn't appropriate. I hadn't necessarily thought about the advice that she wanted to receive with that. And the peer feedback that we've thought about. Of course, that is a thin line. You know, if we're not careful, everybody jumps in with the advice, don't they? You know, and the poor learner gets the advice from the tutor, the advice from somebody sitting out there, and we need to moderate some of that. But peer feedback can be really useful if we know somebody's very good. Again, I remember a very good ringer who would always quietly take somebody down and spend the time with the theory and just giving that review and taking them on that journey with there. So my final slide, just with some final thoughts then to take away from this particular session then. So I put some of those, what I call the A's, you know, thinking about whether feedback, you know, it should be adaptable. It should have goals and actions that we're potentially thinking about. It should be appropriate and accurate and active for that particular situation. Being critical is fine. Just be careful about how you give some of that advice. You know, the classic thing that perhaps we don't necessarily jump in with is don't. It's very easy to say something, you know, don't do this. It's not our approach. We don't do it this way. But how can we be honest and realistic and critical, but not necessarily digging down into the criticism? So think about reflecting, good observation to base our feedback on, good reviewing, and how are we reporting that and taking that forward, and encourage our ringers to want feedback, to see its value, to be involved within it, and the ringing band to really build feedback effectively into how you move forward, make it a natural part of the ringing community. And my little just sort of pet hate at the bottom there. I don't think that shouting is necessary in terms of giving feedback, unless it's something that it needs an immediate action in terms of potential harm. So it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I hope that's been of value. Potentially we may have a chance just to have some initial views on that, but very happy to take this forward in terms offline or wherever, in terms of thinking a little bit more about feedback. Thank you.